On Friday evening, September 1st, 1944, Aline Kearney curled up on the living room couch with her 2 young daughters and her nephew Roger at her home in Mattoon, Illinois. Aline had a picture book open on her lap, and the kids were all cuddled around her, listening to her tell a bedtime story. A warm breeze was blowing in through the open windows, and in the kitchen, she could hear her sister Martha making tea. Aline's husband, Bert, was out driving on his taxi route, so Aline had asked Martha and Roger to come keep her company. Aline was used to her husband's late-night taxi driving, but she still hated being home alone with the kids after dark, and she'd become even more afraid after the US entered World War II almost 3 years ago. She knew it was probably silly, but there were a lot of rumors about Nazi spies planning attacks on unsuspecting Americans. And so it just made Aline even more nervous. She constantly felt anxious, and so having company around helped her nerves a bit. Soon, the clock above the mantel chimed 11 p.m., and so they all headed for bed. Aline brought her 3-year-old daughter, Dorothy, along with her to her bedroom. Dorothy liked to sleep with Aline on the nights when Bert wasn't home. Meanwhile, Martha, Roger, and Aline's youngest daughter, Carol, stayed in the guest room across the hall. Aline helped Dorothy climb into bed, then she cracked open the window to let some warm evening air into the stuffy bedroom. After that, Aline crept under the covers as well, next to her daughter. But just as she was starting to doze off, Aline noticed the sickeningly sweet odor filling the bedroom. She sat upright and looked around the room for the source of the smell, but there was nothing obvious, so she figured it must be coming from the flower box she kept hanging right outside the window. So she laid back down and tried to go to sleep. However, as the minutes ticked by, the strange smell only grew stronger and more potent, and so eventually Aline got up and walked over to the bedroom window to get a better smell. But as she stood there, her legs suddenly felt really stiff, like she was becoming paralyzed. Aline called out for her sister, and seconds later, Martha burst in. Aline told her to please come over here and shut the bedroom window. Martha didn't understand what was going on, but immediately shut it. And then afterward, she reflexively began to wrinkle her nose at the strange smell that seemed to be making her sister sick. But before either could talk about the smell, Aline shrieked out that she could barely feel her legs, and so Martha ran to the kitchen telephone to call their neighbor for help. Aline was rattled. She grabbed little Dorothy, who was looking pretty shaken herself, and she carried her to the living room on her very shaky, stiff legs. Soon, she could hear police sirens drawing closer, and then a moment later, the neighbor ran in through the front door with a pair of police officers in tow. Aline told the officers that she wasn't sure what had just happened, but she was pretty sure she just suffered some kind of gas attack. She explained how her bedroom had suddenly filled with this weird, sickeningly sweet smell, and then her legs had stiffened up, and then luckily her sister had run in and shut the window and sort of stopped the symptoms from getting worse. The officers searched the property, but after about 20 minutes, they admitted that they had not found anything suspicious. They walked the perimeter of the house and the yard, but nothing seemed out of place, and so they had no clue what the smell was or what may have caused it. The officers did suggest that Aline go to the hospital and get checked out, but she said she was not about to do anything until her husband Bert got home. A few minutes later, around midnight, Bert received a call from his dispatcher about a possible chemical attack at his house. Instantly terrified, he wheeled his taxi around and raced toward home. All he could think of was Aline and his daughters. He turned onto his street and pulled up to his house. And at first, everything looked normal. The police had already left by this point, and just the family car was in the driveway. But as he got out of the taxi, Bert saw this figure, a tall man dressed in dark clothing with a tight-fitting cap, standing right outside the living room window. Bert stared at this guy in disbelief. The man seemed to be spying on his family. Bert shouted out, and the stranger tore off running into the alleyway behind the house. Bert dashed after him, sprinting down the side yard and across the back into the alleyway, but then he looked left and right, and the man was just gone. Bert wanted to catch his breath, but he didn't have time. Instead, he turned and ran back to his house. He went inside and made a beeline for the kitchen phone, all the while yelling out to his wife that he was home. Then Bert picked up the phone, called the police, and told them that somebody was prowling outside his house. An hour later, Bert stuffed a duffel bag into his car and held the passenger door open for Aline and his daughters. He'd already sent Martha and Roger home just to be safe. The police had arrived quickly and canvassed his property for the second time that evening, but they didn't find anyone matching his description of the strange prowler. They promised they would file a report right when they got back to the station, but Bert just hadn't felt good about anybody staying at the house right now. And so he decided to move his family to a relative's house across town. By this point, luckily, Aline had regained feeling in her legs, and so basically was back to normal. However, Aline and Bert's daughter, Dorothy, said she felt nauseous. And so the parents' plan was if she didn't feel better by morning, they would take her to the doctor, and they would also, while they were there, have Aline checked out as well. The following morning, Dorothy was still feeling sick, so Bert took his family to the hospital. And while they waited for a doctor to see Aline and Dorothy, Bert paced around the waiting room and eventually grabbed a copy of the local paper, the Journal-Gazette. And when Bert saw the front page headline, he was shocked. It read, "Anesthetic Prowler on the Loose." Bert read that the authorities suspected that his daughter and his wife had been attacked with some kind of anesthetic gas. They were being called the Prowler's first victims, and the Prowler, the police believed, was the person that Bert had seen looking in his window when he had come back home. The article said the Mattoon police were working hard to find this mysterious stranger and apprehend him because they believed he had access to poison gas and would continue to do this to other people. Now, Bert knew, clearly something bad had happened at his house the night before, between whatever happened to his wife and daughter and then seeing that person outside. But at no point had he ever really suspected that his family was being poisoned. And so the idea that that's what police thought was going on here was terrifying. He realized that his family was lucky to be alive. Three days later, 46-year-old Beulah Cordes and her husband Carl got home after a nice dinner out. They'd spent the whole evening talking about the so-called Mattoon gasser. At least that's what the neighbors were calling the suspected prowler. Beulah knew the situation was serious, but things like this never happened in Mattoon. So she and Carl let themselves get a bit carried away with all the gossip. But now, Beulah was ready to unwind and relax a bit before bed. They came in through the back door, then kicked off their shoes and headed to the living room. Beulah sat down in her usual chair while Carl flicked on the radio. And Beulah had just gotten comfortable when she noticed something small and white stuck in the screen of their front door. Curious, she crossed the room and grabbed it. It was a white rag about the size of a dish towel, and there was a large wet spot right in the center of it. And without thinking, Beulah raised the rag to her nose and sniffed in to see if she could figure out what the spot was. The moment she inhaled, she knew it was a mistake. A feeling like an electric current raced down her body and began to tingle her feet. Then her knees began to shake like electricity was coursing through them too. Beulah shrieked, and as soon as she did, she felt this deep burning sensation in her throat. And that burning sensation traveled up to her mouth, and before long she could feel her lips swelling, and that made her scream even louder. Carl came running over and asked her what was going on, but she couldn't form words to explain what was happening. She tried to take a breath, but as soon as she did, she felt something rising in her throat. And so she ran to the kitchen and leaned over the sink to spit out whatever was in her throat. But when she did, it was bright red. She was coughing up blood. Seconds later, Carl was on the phone with the doctor. Beulah was stretched out on the sofa by the time her physician, Dr. Bailey, arrived to examine her. She sat up and thanked him for racing over so quickly. Dr. Bailey checked her vitals and asked her about her symptoms. He also put on a face mask so he could safely take a look at the rag Beulah had found in her screen door. Beulah just watched as her doctor held up the rag and turned it over in his hand. Finally, Dr. Bailey said that he couldn't say for sure, but the rag had the sweet scent of chloroform, an anesthetic sometimes used during surgery. But he explained that when it's inhaled in high concentrations, it can irritate the nose and throat, it can interfere with coordination, and cause waves of nausea. Beulah instantly felt like that was exactly what she experienced, like it must have been chloroform. However, she and Carl did not keep chloroform in their house. A chill ran through Beulah as she realized that she must have been the newest victim of the mad gasser. She told her husband to call the police. Within minutes, a police car pulled into the driveway outside of Beulah's house, and a pair of officers came to the front door. Carl let them in and showed them the toxic rag that Beulah had found. Beulah watched from the couch as the officers began to search their house. She was feeling better, her stomach had calmed down, and the electric current sensation had finally left her body. Her lips were still swollen, but she'd stopped spitting up blood. More than anything, she was just rattled, knowing the Mattoon gasser had been on her doorstep. After police searched the inside of the house, they made their way out to the front porch. And a couple of minutes later, one of the officers came back inside carrying a thin silver key, as well as an empty tube of lipstick. The officer asked if the items belonged to them, but Beulah shook her head and said no. Someone must have left them on her porch. Eventually, the police left to go canvass the neighborhood. It was clear to Beulah that an unwelcome visitor had been on their porch, very likely the Mattoon gasser, and that they had clearly wanted to hurt them. And so Beulah did not feel safe in her own home. And if she really had been poisoned with chloroform, she felt like she should probably go to the hospital and get checked out. But just a few minutes later, Beulah saw the police coming back down the sidewalk, and this time, with them, was a man in handcuffs. Beulah immediately walked over to the window to get a better look, and while she couldn't make out the man's features, she could tell he was tall and slim, and so he fit the description of the Mattoon gasser. After the police stuffed the man into the back of their patrol car and drove off, Beulah suddenly felt relieved. She hoped they just caught the mad gasser of Mattoon. "5 days later, Mattoon Chief of Police C.E. Cole rode shotgun in a police car alongside a fellow investigator. He was on his way to search an abandoned home on the outskirts of town, which he thought might be a potential hideout for the anesthetic prowler, or the mad gasser, as the papers were calling him now. Earlier that week, 2 of his officers had arrested a suspect, a man they'd found loitering down the road from Beulah Cortez's home. However, after questioning him, they realized that this man had simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was only on that block because he was lost and trying to figure out his way home. So Chief Cole had released him, which meant they were back to looking for the real mad gasser. The Journal-Gazette had been reporting on this story nonstop, keeping all of Mattoon on edge, and the chief was feeling tremendous pressure to catch this attacker. Over the past few days, 5 more people had reached out to the police and to the papers, saying that they'd also been victims of the mad gasser. One couple said they were attacked the night before Aline Kearney. Another victim was a local fortune teller who said she even saw the perpetrator, but she described him as big with muscular arms that didn't match the description that Bert Kearney had given of the tall man standing outside his home. Chief Cole also noticed that the method of poisoning changed with each victim, which felt unusual to him. For instance, it seemed like the gas had been pumped through Aline Kearney's window, while the chloroform cloth had been left on Beulah Cortez's front door. The chief wasn't sure what to make of that, but in the meantime, the citizens of Mattoon were not taking any chances. Everyone was on high alert. The police car came to a stop outside of a corner store. On the sidewalk out front, a small group of men in their 30s were leaning on baseball bats as they smoked cigarettes. One of the men kept looking up and down the street. Cole realized they were a neighborhood patrol. He'd heard that a lot of men were walking their neighborhoods at night with baseball bats, trying to keep their homes safe. The chief got out of the car and headed into the store and grabbed a couple of sodas and some batteries for his flashlight. When he got to the register, he glanced over at the newspaper rack that held the daily paper. The headline made him wince. Mattoon's Journal-Gazette had printed yet another story on potential attacks that had happened that week. It said that 2 women had already been hospitalized and 5 more people had fallen ill. And the article was clearly full of criticism about how the city, and specifically the police, were mishandling the case. Chief Cole begrudgingly grabbed a copy of the paper and told the clerk to add it to his total. When he got back to the car, he showed the paper to his fellow officer, and he read one section aloud. It said that Mattoon police were too proud to share all the facts with the public, and sometimes denied that crimes had occurred altogether. Cole had never read a bigger lie in his life. As they drove through town, the chief saw more men sitting out on their front porches, shotguns across their laps. It was like they were daring the mad gasser to trespass. Cole had also heard that women had begun carrying golf clubs with them whenever they left the house. The whole city was terrified, and the chief knew it was up to him to close this case fast. Cole knew they were nearing the edge of town when the stench of burning diesel fuel hit his nostrils. Most of the industrial plants were out this way, including a diesel engine manufacturing plant that employed about 500 of Mattoon's residents. On a windy day, the whole town could smell like these factories. Eventually, they pulled up to a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town that the chief suspected could be the gasser's hideout. It looked like nobody had lived there for years. Cole and his fellow officer began searching the outside of the property, but nothing seemed out of place. So he walked up the rickety steps to the front door and pushed on it. And it didn't take much pushing to wrench the door wide open. Inside, the house was covered in a thick layer of dust. Chief Cole and the other officer split up and began searching the house. While the other officer quietly tiptoed upstairs, the chief found the door to the basement and began going down these steep, narrow steps. When Cole reached the bottom, the basement was pitch black, except for a little light that filtered in through a dirty window. The chief clicked on his flashlight so he could see into all the dark corners. The basement was like a cement box and smelled like mold. The chief half expected to find some kind of makeshift laboratory down here, or maybe even the gasser himself mixing up different chloroform weapons. But there was nothing. Just a dank, dusty basement, not even a set of footprints along the floor. The house wound up being completely clear. It was obvious nobody had been in the structure for years. And so by the time Cole and his partner were back out in the car, Cole realized he had zero leads on who the mad gasser was and where he was hiding. The following evening, Chief Cole arrived at the station to find 5 squad cars from the Illinois State Police parked outside. He'd asked for their help after he had searched that abandoned house and found nothing. He hoped they wouldn't have to stay for too long, but for now, he needed their help. Chief Cole went inside the station and made his way right to his office, where he sat down in his seat. Then he flicked on the radio and poured himself a glass of whiskey. Once the evening news started, as expected, the mad gasser of Mattoon was their main story. However, tonight, instead of just updating the public on details of the attacks, the announcer would also be reading a statement that Chief Cole had issued that afternoon. Chief Cole smiled to himself, confident that this entire fiasco would soon come to an end. All day, his team and the state police had been interviewing people non-stop, anyone they felt might be connected to the case. But nobody emerged as a viable suspect. And that's when the chief started thinking, and a new theory came to him. So after lunch, he'd taken another trip to the outskirts of town. And as he was driving by the manufacturing plants, a strong breeze had filled his car with this odd, sweet smell. It was coming from the Atlas Imperial Diesel Engine Company. Cole had done some investigating and learned that recently, Atlas had begun making supplies for the soldiers overseas. And to make some of these supplies, they used a large amount of carbon tetrachloride, a clear, non-flammable liquid that produced a sweet odor when it evaporated. It also smelled a lot like chloroform. To Chief Cole, it was now clear to him that there was no mad gasser. Instead, the balmy late summer breeze had been carrying this chemical vapor into town and causing all these illnesses. So he'd asked all the local radio stations to read his statement, laying out his findings. And Chief Cole hoped that after everyone heard it, they would finally have peace of mind. And sure enough, at some point, the radio announcer did read the statement. And at the end of it, he laid out Cole's simple fix for the so-called gas attacks. Basically, all people had to do was simply close their windows at night, and they would be okay. When the broadcast finally ended, Chief Cole turned off the radio and left his office feeling better than he had in days. But that good feeling lasted less than 12 hours. The next morning, Chief Cole was once again feeling very stressed as he shook hands with 2 physicians at Mattoon's Memorial Hospital. Overnight, his confidence in having solved the case was shaken. The Atlas Diesel Company had released a statement of their own, pointing out a flaw in Chief Cole's theory. None of their plant workers, who spent all day surrounded by those fumes, had ever gotten sick from the carbon tetrachloride. So there was no way the tetrachloride was responsible for poisoning people in town. Chief Cole knew that if the factory fumes weren't causing the problem, well, then realistically, there might be a mad gasser, and his investigation would be back at square one. And he needed answers fast, because by this point, at least 7 households had been targeted by the mad gasser. People were calling the police department with all kinds of leads, and the newspaper had been reporting on the attacks daily. If he didn't figure this out soon, he could have a riot on his hands. So, Cole had called a meeting with the doctors who were treating the latest victims to see if they had found any medical evidence to help him figure out what was going on here. And when Chief Cole spoke to the physicians, something immediately stood out to him. All the victims had already been sent home. But as the doctors explained their reasoning for sending people home, Cole began to understand why. He started to remember small details about each of the poisonings, inconsistencies that he'd ignored at the time. But now they were fitting together and painting a very different picture of what could be going on here. Despite the chief's embarrassment over yesterday's radio broadcast where his statement was read and was so clearly wrong, Cole realized he did need to speak out again, this time directly to the public. It was time to call a press conference. Later that day, on September 12, 1944, Chief Cole and the Mattoon Commissioner of Public Health stood together in front of City Hall. Several journalists and concerned citizens spread out on the steps below them, clearly anticipating a big announcement around the mad gasser. The commissioner began his speech, saying that sooner or later, this mad gasser frenzy was going to get someone killed. But they weren't going to die from a gas attack. Because there was no mad gasser of Mattoon, just like Chief Cole thought. However, Chief Cole did not have everything right when he first came out with that public address on the radio. When Chief Cole met with the doctors at the hospital, they told him that they had ran tests on the people who had supposedly been attacked by the gasser. But these tests showed no evidence of poison gas or any other chemical in their stomachs or their blood. In fact, all of the victims were perfectly healthy. The only way the doctors could explain this was to conclude that there never was a gas attack at all. They agreed their victims had truly suffered from something, but what they suffered from was extreme nervous tension. The mad gasser of Mattoon was actually a case of mass hysteria. Mattoon had been enduring wartime deprivations for years. Half of the men in town were fighting overseas in World War II, and every day the papers ran stories about the war and hometown soldiers who had died. The entire town was afraid and anxious. Aline Kearney, the first victim, was intensely afraid of being alone in her home at night. It's possible that stress and anxiety created physical symptoms like nausea and dizziness. When Beulah Cordes, the second victim, saw a rag in her door, it's likely she remembered Aline's story about poison gas, and then her body sort of unconsciously mimicked Aline's symptoms after she smelled it. And once Aline and Beulah's stories got out, more people just began thinking they'd been poisoned too. And it sort of made sense, because suddenly normal symptoms like getting a headache or feeling a little bit dizzy and some fatigue quickly became symptoms of a gas attack, and only added to the rumors about a malevolent stranger prowling the streets of Mattoon. And remember, the whole town had heard about how Bert had come home, shortly after the gas attack on Aline, and he saw that guy standing outside his house looking in the window, and he chased him off into the alleyway. They never caught that guy, but he quickly became sort of like the boogeyman. He was the mad gasser, and it sort of solidified this idea that this was a real thing, that somebody was literally targeting people in this town with poisonous gas. However, once the media began reporting on the mass hysteria theory, the police did not receive any more phone calls about gas attacks. Sociologists now use Mattoon, Illinois, as the textbook example of mass psychogenic illness, where fear itself can fuel physical symptoms that can quickly spread through an entire community. Also, local media can play a large role in shaping and amplifying these narratives. There are still some who believe that Aline and Beulah might have been genuine victims of a prowler who maybe attacked them with gas, who then skipped town once the media started reporting on his attacks. And then from there, maybe the 5 additional victims were actually suffering from mass hysteria. But there's no way to know for sure what truly happened. And so for now, the evidence suggests it was all just in their heads. On the evening of March 1st, 2018, 55-year-old Ted Shaughnessy placed a necklace in a glass display case in his high-end jewelry store in Austin, Texas. Ted adjusted his glasses on his face and then leaned in a bit closer, and he saw the lights in the case bounce off the gold and jewels in this necklace, and it was so beautiful, he just smiled. He and his wife Cory had owned this jewelry store for 20 years. Cory had a keen eye for jewelry, so she worked as the appraiser, choosing which pieces to buy and then sell inside of the store, and also determining how much they were worth. And Ted was a great salesman. Ted took pride in the way he displayed the jewelry in the store. He wanted to draw the customers in, and then once they were there, Ted would approach them like they were lifelong friends. Now, part of the reason he did this was just because it was an effective sales tactic. But also, Ted really did love meeting and talking with people who came in to shop off the street. That's actually one of the reasons he'd worked in retail for most of his adult life. Ted locked the display case and walked around the shop, turning off lights and closing things up for the day. Then he set the security alarm, headed out the door, and locked it behind him. Some nights, Ted would stay at the jewelry store long after it had closed to go over the books or to redo the displays. But tonight, he wanted to get home as quickly as he could. He and his wife had plans to spend the entire night doing one of their favorite things, eating a great home-cooked meal together and just relaxing and watching TV. After leaving the store, Ted climbed into his car and headed home. About 25 minutes later, he pulled into his neighborhood and he looked around at all the huge houses with sprawling front yards and swimming pools out back. He found his house, which was just as big as all the others, and he pulled into the long driveway and came to a stop. He got out of the car, walked inside his house through the front door, and the moment he was inside, he was hit with this wonderful smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. But before he could even call out to his wife, he heard loud clacking sounds on the hardwood floors as 2 large dogs bounded through the front room towards him. Ted enthusiastically knelt down and began goofing around with the dogs and asking them how they were doing, like they could answer back. Then he stood back up, and the dogs followed at his heels as Ted made his way through the house, which could feel like walking through a maze for somebody who had never been there. Ted and the dogs got to the kitchen, and Ted saw his wife Cory standing over the stove. Cory turned around, and Ted immediately walked over, put his hands on her waist, and gave her a kiss. Ted helped his wife put some finishing touches on the meal, and then they both got excited about the night ahead of them. They knew a lot of people would find this to be a pretty boring way to spend the night, but Ted and Cory really were never happier than when they were just hanging out together. After the food was finally done cooking, the couple sat down and ate their great meal at the dining room table, while their dogs just stared at them, hoping for some scraps. After they were all done eating, Ted cleared the table and took the dishes into the kitchen. One of the dogs, a Rottweiler named Bart, followed him every step of the way. After Ted rinsed off the dishes, he joined his wife on the couch in the front room. He draped his arm around her shoulder, and she leaned her head on his chest as they began to watch TV. They spent the night flipping between channels, really only half paying attention. Most of the time, they just talked about things at the jewelry store, and also how their son and his girlfriend seemed to be getting pretty serious. Even though their 19-year-old son only lived about 2 hours away in College Station, Texas, and they saw him often, it still felt strange to be empty nesters, and not to have him in the house anymore. Before they knew it, they had spent hours just sitting there talking, and they'd both begun to feel tired. So Ted flipped off the TV, and the couple headed to their bedroom, with both of their trusty dogs trotting along right behind them. A little before 4:45 a.m. on March 2nd, 2018, so several hours after Ted and Cory had gone to bed, they both suddenly woke up to the sound of their dogs barking in their room. Ted flipped on the light on his bedside table, and he and his wife looked over and saw their dogs barking away, standing right by the bedroom door. Ted tried to get them to calm down, but they just kept on barking over and over again. Ted could see his wife looked frightened, and he was feeling a bit freaked out too. The dogs were both really good guard dogs, and they usually only got agitated when they'd heard something. And so Ted slowly got out of bed, opened the drawer on the bedside table, and pulled out a .45 caliber handgun. He checked to make sure it was loaded, and then told his wife to stay in the room. Ted walked over to the door, opened it up, and headed outside. He made his way into the dark kitchen, and Bart the Rottweiler followed right behind. Just a few minutes later, Cory threw open her closet door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut behind her. She crouched down in the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible, and as she sat there panting, out of breath, she clutched her phone in one hand, and in the other hand, she was holding a .357 caliber revolver. She dialed 911 on her phone and pressed it to her ear, and at the same time, she held the gun out in front of her, aimed at the closet door in case anybody approached her. She heard the sound of the emergency operator on the other line, and she said the police needed to get to her house right away. Multiple gunshots had been fired, she didn't know if her husband was even alive at this point, and she said she was sure she would be dead within seconds. "15 minutes later, so just after 5 a.m., Travis County homicide detectives James Moore and Paul Salo headed up the long walkway toward Ted and Cory's front door. By this point, crime scene tape had already been stretched across the large property, several uniformed police officers stood on the lawn, and 2 officers stood near the front door with Cory, who was there in her nightgown, sobbing. Detectives Moore and Salo introduced themselves to Cory and told her they'd be back to her shortly. Then they put on their gloves and headed inside of her house. Just standing in the front room, both detectives got a sense of how big this house was, and how many different hallways and paths there were to take. They made their way through the front room and walked into the kitchen, where a team of forensics officers were already searching for evidence. On the floor, sprawled out under the kitchen table, the detectives saw Ted Shaughnessy's body. Blood covered his face and his chest. But the detectives also saw something that completely threw them off. Because in the call they got, they'd already been told about Ted being deceased. But they didn't expect to also see his pet dog lying right there with him. Bart, the Rottweiler, had clearly been shot and killed, laying just a few feet in front of Ted, like he'd been trying to maybe protect him. One of the forensics officers joined Detectives Moore and Salo and pointed out multiple bullet casings littering the kitchen floor. In fact, there were so many casings that the detectives thought it looked like a massive shootout had taken place right there in the kitchen. The detectives walked over to the kitchen table and knelt down by Ted's body. Near his outstretched hand, they saw a .45 caliber handgun. Moore checked the magazine and saw it was full, so it appeared like Ted had not fired a single shot from his weapon. However, Moore asked the forensics officer if there was any chance that Ted maybe did fire off some shots and actually emptied out a magazine and then reloaded. And then once it was reloaded, maybe he didn't fire again, giving the impression he had not shot at all. Now, Moore didn't think this was likely, but he just wanted to be sure. The forensics officer told him they were still looking at everything, but so far, none of the casings they'd found matched the caliber of Ted's gun. So very likely Ted did not fire a single shot. After spending some time searching the kitchen and also studying Ted's wounds, Moore and Salo began to make their way through the rest of the house. They found a home security system that was not armed, and they didn't find any evidence of forced entry at the front, back, or side doors. They thought maybe whoever had killed Ted had been invited inside the home, or at the very least had a key. However, as soon as they stepped into one of the bedrooms, they immediately began to rethink that theory. Based on the way the room was decorated, it appeared to belong to a young man. But more importantly, when they looked inside this room, they could see that one of the windows was open, and the window screen had been removed and dropped down onto the ground just outside. Moore and Salo went back to the kitchen and told the forensics officers what they just found. And as members of the forensics team headed to that bedroom, the detectives made their way to the front of the house and walked outside. They saw Ted's wife, Cory, still standing with the 2 officers. They approached her and gently asked if she was up to answering a few questions. Cory wiped some tears away from her face, but then nodded and said she was. And so Detective Salo asked her if she could just walk them through what had happened that morning. Cory said that she and her husband had woken up sometime around 4:45 a.m. when they heard their dogs barking. Ted had grabbed his gun and walked out with one of the dogs, while she had stayed back in the bedroom with the other dog. But then she said she heard gunshots coming from the kitchen, so she grabbed her own gun and ran out of the bedroom. She could hear her husband screaming, but there was also this bright light shining directly at her, making it really hard to see. All she could see were shadows moving around in front of her. But then she saw one of these shadows fire a gun and kill one of their dogs, and so instinctively she raised her own gun and unloaded her weapon, trying to hit the shadow. Detective Salo asked her what kind of weapon she had, and Cory said she had a .357 revolver. Salo and Moore looked at each other, but didn't say anything. Cory had just admitted she fired her weapon inside the house, and they've just found her husband dead from gunshots. So either she was lying and was making this whole thing up about shadows to cover up her part in the crime, or this really happened. Detective Moore asked Cory if one of the bedrooms in the house belonged to a young man. Cory said they must mean her son's room. She said she still had his room, but he was 19 years old now and lived a couple of hours away with his girlfriend. And she'd already asked an officer to call them right after police had arrived, and they were on their way right now. Detective Salo asked Cory if she could give any description of the person she'd fired her gun at, even though it was dark and shadowy. Cory shook her head and said no. She figured it was just a burglar. After all, she and Ted were well known in the area for their jewelry store and for having made a good amount of money. And so they knew they were a target for robbery. After this, Salo and Moore stepped away from Cory and headed back inside the house. And already they were starting to question some of Cory's answers. Like most spouses in murder cases, Cory was immediately considered a suspect, and the fact that her weapon had been fired in the house only made her a stronger one. On top of that, when she called 911, she said she was hiding in the closet, and she was sure whoever was inside her house was coming for her. But when the police had arrived and done a sweep of the house, nobody was there. Finally, Cory had just claimed that she thought this was all a robbery gone bad. However, the detectives had walked through the house and seen stacks of cash, high-end jewelry, and expensive electronics just laying out, untouched. And Cory and Ted's safe did not look like anyone had even tried to break into it, so why would a robber leave without taking a single thing of value? Still, the son's bedroom window had been opened, and so if Cory had done that to try to stage things to make it look like a break-in and robbery, she didn't do anything else to the house to back that up. The detectives talked this over as they went back to the son's bedroom, and when they walked in, one of the forensics officers had a smile on his face, and he said they had just pulled a really clear fingerprint off the outside of the window, so they hoped that would lead them right to the person who had climbed in. And as Moore and Salo stood there, something began to hit them. If somebody did really break into the house through this window, climb into this bedroom, and then make their way all the way to the kitchen, they would almost have to have some previous knowledge of the layout of this place. Because even with all the lights on, this was not an easy house to navigate. It was massive and basically like a big labyrinth. So now, the detectives felt almost convinced that even if Ted's wife was not involved, somebody who Ted knew and who had very likely been to this particular house many times must have been his killer. A couple hours later, at 8 a.m. on March 2nd, a car pulled up in front of the house. Ted's 19-year-old son, Nicholas, and Nicholas's girlfriend, Jackie Edison, parked behind the line of police cars outside the house that Nicholas had grown up inside of. They both got out of the car and immediately spotted Cory, who was still standing in the front yard, and began running towards her. An officer stopped them, but when they said who they were, he let them by. A moment later, Nicholas and Jackie were hugging Cory, and all three of them just stood there crying. Inside the house, detectives Moore and Salo got word that Ted's son had just arrived. So they quickly went outside and found Nicholas and Jackie still standing with Cory. The detectives apologized for interrupting, but they asked Nicholas if they could talk to him for a few minutes. Nicholas said of course, and then followed the detectives across the yard to a spot where they'd be able to talk without anybody else hearing. Moore started off by asking Nicholas where he'd been around 4:45 a.m. that morning, the time the 911 call had come in, and Nicholas said that he and his girlfriend were asleep at their place in College Station. Jackie was a student at Texas A&M down there, and Nicholas worked trading stocks as a day trader. Moore took down a few notes and then asked Nicholas if there was anyone he could think of who had a problem with his father and might have wanted to do this. But Nicholas shook his head and said basically everybody who knew his parents loved them. Moore asked if there was anything at all about Nicholas's dad that he could think of that could maybe help them, even if it was really small. Nicholas thought about it for a few seconds, and then suddenly his eyes went wide, like he just remembered something. He said there was one thing that could be important, but it was a really weird situation. When he'd still been living at home, his next-door neighbor had come to him and said she thought that her husband was cheating on her. This neighbor knew Nicholas was pretty good with technology, so she'd asked if there was any way he could track her husband or something, and she told him she would pay him for his services. Nicholas had felt strange getting involved in something like this, but his next-door neighbor was a nice woman and a good friend of his mother's, so he had helped her. He had put a tracker on her husband's car and followed him one night to another woman's house, and it became clear pretty quickly that the man was cheating on his wife. Now, Nicholas got a worried look on his face. He'd always assumed the husband never knew he was involved in helping the wife catch him cheating. But if this man had found out it was him, he might have wanted revenge, and his dad might be dead because of it. After that, the detectives told Nicholas he could go rejoin his mother. After he had walked off, the two men just looked at each other and shook their heads in disbelief. That was a really weird story. Neither of them had ever run into a teenager who had acted like a private investigator to catch a cheating husband. It almost sounded made up, or like something the kid might have watched on TV. But regardless, it was a good lead. After Moore and Salo finished up their initial work at Ted and Cory's house, they walked next door to the neighbor's house. They knocked on the front door, and a woman answered, and quickly she invited them inside. They all sat down at her kitchen table, and the detectives didn't waste any time. They needed to know if Nicholas's wild story about trailing this woman's husband was true. The woman looked a little embarrassed, but she said Nicholas was telling the truth. She felt bad for dragging a teenager into her marital problems, but she had been desperate. Detective Moore leaned in and told her he did not need all the details about her marriage, but he needed to know one thing. It was extremely important. Had she ever told her husband about Nicholas's involvement in all of this? The woman didn't hesitate. She said no way would she ever do that. Her husband, who had since moved away and was soon to be her ex-husband, had no idea at all about Nicholas. And as she was talking, the reason for this line of questioning finally dawned on her. And she stopped and just said her husband might have cheated on her, but there was no way he would have ever attacked Ted or anybody else like that. The detectives left the house not long after that and headed back to the station. Despite what the woman said about her husband, they knew they still had to track him down and get more information directly from him. In the days following the murder, while members of their investigative team followed up on the neighbor's husband, Moore and Salo contacted Ted's closest friends to see what else they could learn about him. But not much new came from that. Everybody seemed to like Ted, and nobody could understand who would do this unless it was a robbery. Now, while the detectives still were not convinced Ted's death was the result of a robbery gone wrong, they did start to look more into the jewelry store to see if maybe somebody had been staking the place out and following Ted home. However, they got a phone call from Ted's son, Nicholas, that caused them to quickly change the direction of their investigation. Nicholas was aware that his bedroom window had been found open on the night his father was killed, and he said he just couldn't stop thinking about it, and in fact, there was something he felt like he needed to share with the detectives. He told them when he was younger, he would use his bedroom window to sneak out of the house and then get back inside without his parents knowing. It was just stupid teenager stuff, nothing serious, but he did it so often that he made a habit of just keeping that window unlocked. Now he realized that particular window might have been left unlocked even after he had moved out. But what Nicholas said was really weighing on him was that there was only really one other person who knew he did this with his window, and that was his friend Spencer Patterson. Because he and Spencer had crept out of that window a bunch of times together when Spencer had slept over. Detective Salo asked Nicholas if the reason he was so worried was because maybe Spencer had some reason to come after Nicholas now? Like had they had a bad fight or something? Nicholas said no, but he said Spencer would have gone to their house and potentially used that window to get in there and get his parents' money and jewels. Nicholas said Spencer had not really grown up with money of his own, and he'd always been kind of jealous of how wealthy Nicholas's family was. And there was more. Spencer not only knew about the bedroom window, he also knew exactly where to find Nicholas's parents' safe. About a week after the murder, Detective Salo and Moore sat together in an office, going over the notes they'd already put together. And even though their investigation was still relatively new, they felt like they had some promising leads. They still thought there was a strong chance that Cory had simply shot her husband, because in addition to what they'd learned at the house, they'd now discovered that Cory was the beneficiary of Ted's $1 million life insurance policy. She also stood to gain sole ownership of the jewelry store and the house, which were both worth a ton of money too. The detectives believed they'd have a clear idea about Cory's potential involvement in the murder when they got the results of the ballistics tests that would show if Cory's gun had fired the bullets that killed Ted. But the detectives had also started to consider that maybe Cory had been right. Maybe this was a robbery gone bad. And if that was the case, Nicholas's friend, Spencer, had to be high on their suspect list. Even if this robbery had not actually been successful, Spencer did know that Ted and Cory were wealthy, he knew how to sneak in through Nicholas's window, he knew his way around the maze-like house, and he knew where the safe was. Detective Moore picked up the phone, put it on speaker, and called the number he had for Spencer. Spencer picked up, and Moore quickly introduced himself and then immediately launched into a series of questions. The detectives learned that Spencer had gone over to Ted and Cory's house for dinner about a month ago when Nicholas had been visiting. And they said that they had treated him like he was one of the family, just like they'd done since he was a kid. Moore asked Spencer how he and Nicholas used to sneak out of the house when they were younger. And Spencer talked about using the bedroom window, just like Nicholas had said. While the detectives talked to Spencer, they kept getting the feeling like he was holding something back. The kid was being very cooperative and answering their questions, but there just seemed like there was always this hesitation, or like he was about to say something and then chose not to. By the end of the call, Moore and Salo still did not feel satisfied, so they scheduled an in-person meeting with Spencer. And in the meantime, they decided to keep a close eye on their other major suspect. About a week later, in late March, Nicholas and Jackie were sitting on the couch in the front room of Ted and Cory's house, looking at Cory as she stared out the window onto the street. Nicholas didn't want his mom to be alone, so he told her that he and Jackie would stay at the house as long as they needed to. That had cheered Cory up, but it was clear she was still struggling. And today, Nicholas and Jackie were extra worried about her, because she kept standing there just staring out the window. They had no idea why. But suddenly, Cory turned around and told them to come over and take a look for themselves. And so Nicholas and Jackie walked over to the window, and Cory pointed to a plain-looking sedan on the street. She told them she thought it was a cop and that he was watching her. At first, this seemed like paranoia to Nicholas and Jackie. However, when Nicholas looked out the window and he got a good look at that car before it drove off, he thought his mom was right. It definitely could be an unmarked police car. Cory stepped away from the window and collapsed onto the couch. She didn't understand why the police would be watching her. Why weren't they out finding the person who had actually killed her husband? Nicholas looked over at his mom, and he could tell she was just in total despair. And so he leaned over to Jackie and whispered something in her ear. Jackie was surprised by what she just heard, but she quickly smiled and nodded her head. And so Nicholas took Jackie's hand, and together they walked over to the couch where Cory was. And then Nicholas took a breath and said that he and Jackie had something very important he wanted to tell her. They were not just boyfriend and girlfriend anymore, they had actually gotten married. Cory instantly sat up and just stared at them for a second, shocked. Nicholas quickly said that they had planned to tell her and Dad when they came to visit next, and they still wanted to have a big ceremony, but they had just decided they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together, and so they had just gotten it done and gotten married. After a tense couple of seconds, Cory broke down in tears, but these were tears of joy. She got off the couch, smiled, and hugged Jackie and told her how happy she was to welcome her to the family. Then Cory said Jackie should go pick an engagement ring from their jewelry shop, and then they should have a big engagement party. Even if they were already married, she didn't want her to miss out on anything. And who knows, maybe this was a way for them to start to heal a bit and move forward as a family. Nicholas was very relieved. He was so glad the news had made his mom as happy as he hoped it would. But as excited as she seemed, and as much as they all wanted something to celebrate during this terrible time, Nicholas just couldn't shake the image of that unmarked police car staking out his mother's house. Over the following weeks, the investigative team continued to dig into the Shaughnessy's financial records, and they also did keep eyes on Cory's house. While that was going on, Detectives Moore and Salo met in person with Nicholas's friend Spencer. And somehow, being face-to-face with him made them feel even more like he was hiding something. And it was strange, because on the surface, Spencer seemed cooperative and like he wanted to help. But there was just something about the way this kid spoke that convinced Moore and Salo that they couldn't fully trust him. So, after meeting with Spencer at the station, the detectives secured warrants to search Spencer's house and his car. Now, the search of the house didn't turn up anything out of the ordinary. However, when they went through Spencer's car, they found a .380 caliber gun. Spencer had never mentioned having this gun, which seemed a little odd since he knew he was being investigated for a shooting. The detectives thought if he had wanted to clear himself, he wouldn't try to hide the fact that he owned a gun. And within days, this new piece of evidence looked a lot more damning, because when ballistics reports came back, they showed that some of the bullets fired at the crime scene came from a .357, which matched Cory's gun, and some of the others came from a .380, just like Spencer's. About a month after Ted's murder, Detectives Moore and Salo believed they had Ted's killer in their sights. They collected more financial records and cell phone data to try to tie up any loose ends, and then they brought Spencer into the station for one last interview. Spencer sat down at a small table across from Salo and Moore in a brightly lit, cramped room. He'd always seemed a bit nervous to the detectives, but today, he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But despite that, Moore and Salo didn't go on the attack. Spencer was young, and he was nervous and scared. So, Moore tried to put him at ease. He told him they thought they knew what happened on the morning Ted died. They just needed Spencer to help them fill in the blanks. And before Spencer could even begin to talk, the detectives confronted him with all the evidence they had in the case. And so they told him there really wasn't any point trying to hide anything anymore. After a very tense minute, Spencer looked across the table at the detectives and then told them everything he knew. Following that interview, it would take Moore and Salo several more weeks to nail everything down. But in May of 2018, 2 months after Ted's murder, they knew exactly what had happened and who had fired the shots that killed Ted Shaughnessy. Based on Spencer's interview, cell phone data, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Ted in the early morning hours of March 2nd, 2018. On that morning, the killers crept through the dark house, led only by the light shining from one of their phones. They each held a gun in their hands, and they tried to move as slowly and quietly as possible. But when they made it to the kitchen and turned towards the main bedroom, they heard dogs start barking. The killers froze, not sure what to do. One of the dogs sounded really aggressive. The killer holding the phone shined the light towards the bedroom door, and right away they both saw something moving towards them. As the barking got louder and they heard footsteps and loud clacking on the wooden floors, suddenly the light illuminated the dog, and it was the Rottweiler Bart, bounding towards them, baring his teeth. One of the killers instinctively raised their gun and fired off a shot. The dog squealed and fell to the kitchen floor. Ted screamed and ran into the kitchen after the dog. He raised his gun, but before he could get a shot off, now both killers started firing. The sound of gunshots crashed through the house as bullets hit Ted in the back, the thigh, and the head. Ted collapsed to the floor under the kitchen table, dead. The killers began shouting at each other, starting to panic. This had not gone the way it was supposed to. But before they could make another move, bullets came whizzing out of the dark into the kitchen, hitting the wall and sending pieces of plaster onto the floor. The killer with the cell phone shined the light in the direction of the gunshots, trying to get a clear look at the shooter. Their hands were shaking and they couldn't really aim well, but still the killers just held their guns and started firing wildly. And then finally, the shots stopped and the kitchen fell silent. One of the killers shouted that they needed to get out of there, so they ran out of the kitchen, into one of the bedrooms, and climbed out the open window. Outside, they ran as fast as they could through the darkness back to a car they'd parked down the street. They got in, and one of the killers hit the gas and floored it through the neighborhood while the other killer sat panicking in the passenger seat. They both knew they had screwed up, and now they were going to have to get in touch with the people who had hired them and tell them they'd only taken out one of the intended targets. The killers were two men who had no connection to Ted. However, the two people who hired these men were Ted's own son, Nicholas, and the woman Nicholas had secretly married, Jackie Edison. Nicholas knew if both of his parents were dead, he would inherit their store and their house and benefit from their life insurance policies, all of which would have made him a multimillionaire. And Nicholas really wanted that money, because he had gone into quite a bit of debt from playing the stock market as a day trader. So, with Jackie's help, he found two hitmen and offered to pay them a lot of money to kill both Ted and Cory and to make it look like a robbery. Nicholas told the hitmen about his bedroom window and gave them a complete layout of the house. But on the night of the murder, the hitmen did not imagine they would find themselves in a full-fledged shootout, so when Cory started firing off her .357 at them, the whole plan fell apart. And so when Cory rushed back to her closet to call 911, instead of the hitmen going after her and killing her, they just ran out of the house and didn't even attempt to make it look like a robbery. And then a few hours later, when Nicholas and Jackie arrived at the house, they knew their plan had not worked. So they tried to play the perfect son and daughter-in-law. Nicholas also sent the cops after the neighbor's husband and his close friend Spencer. The neighbor's husband was cleared as a suspect very quickly, but Spencer remained high on the suspect list, just like Cory was, for a significant amount of time. However, when ballistics tests came back, they confirmed that none of the bullets fired from Cory's gun had actually struck Ted, and that the gun that was found in Spencer's car had not been used in the murder. And that fingerprint that had been found on the bedroom window did not match Spencer's. In fact, it just turned out to be an old print from when the window had been manufactured. So the detectives no longer believed Spencer committed the murder, and the more they talked to Spencer, the more they realized he wasn't hiding something to protect himself. He was hiding something to protect his best friend, Nicholas. But in his final meeting with police, Spencer would admit that Nicholas had talked to him on several occasions about wanting to murder his parents and hiring hitmen to do it. And after this, when police dug deeper into Nicholas's phone records, they found a couple of things that sealed the case. Nicholas, being the family member who was the most tech-savvy, set up an app on his phone that enabled him to control the alarm system on his parents' house. And the second discovery, and the far more damning one, was a series of text messages between Nicholas and Jackie in which the two of them were clearly arranging a murder for hire. Nicholas and both shooters were sentenced to 35 years in prison. Jackie cut a plea deal and received 10 years of probation, but with one very specific caveat. She had to spend 2 nights in jail every year on the anniversary of Ted's murder. The afternoon of May 11th, 2015, 55-year-old Natalia was gathering sap inside of a Russian forest with her 82-year-old friend Valia. The two of them had been coming to this grove of birch trees for many years. They enjoyed the peace and solitude of nature, and it was also a good place for Natalia to bring her little dog so he could run around while they collected the sap. It was a perfect spring day. The weather was very mild, the sun was out, and the two friends had a great time just kind of moving around to the different birch trees, using their little drills and hammers to get their taps into the tree, and then they'd put their glass bottles underneath each tap to collect their harvest. And then at some point, Natalia felt like she had all the sap she would need, and she began gathering up her things to get ready to leave. And as she did that, she looked over at Valia, and she had found this really big birch tree, and she had sat down underneath it and was working hard to set her tap. And so as Natalia registered that Valia was over here, kind of doing one more tree before they left, she began looking around for her dog. And she found her dog, and he wasn't too far away from Valia, and he was just kind of moseying around one of the trees, when suddenly Natalia noticed the dog came to a hard stop, and it turned and looked deeper into the forest, like it had clearly registered something that had put it on alert that was out of view. And so Natalia, her view was obscured from whatever the dog was looking at, and so she put down her equipment and kind of moved between the trees to see what her dog was looking at. And at some point, her view cleared, and she saw pretty far off in the forest was something huge, this dark thing kind of moving behind the trees. And suddenly, it jumped out from behind the trees and ran towards the dog. It was a huge Russian brown bear. And so totally horrified, Natalia's watching this bear charge her dog. She looks over, she sees Valia, who's pretty hard of hearing, is sitting with her back to this bear and the dog, still just working on this tree. And Natalia's just frozen for a moment, having no idea what to do. And then instinct suddenly took over, and Natalia just turned and began running away, leaving Valia and leaving the dog. But after only running several paces, she stopped and turned around and saw the bear is still trying to attack the dog, but the dog is standing its ground and barking at the bear, which is kind of causing it to back up and be a little unsure of itself, even though this dog is so much smaller. And still Valia is not reacting at all. She has not heard the bear, the dog, nothing. And Natalia, she's looking back knowing that she needs to do something. She can't just let her friend and her dog get killed. And so Natalia began walking slowly back in the direction of this bear, and she began screaming at Valia to get up and run with her. But the second Natalia began screaming, the bear went from looking at the dog to turning and looking at Natalia, and suddenly it was like the dog meant nothing. The bear had decided it was going to go after Natalia. And so Natalia, she's staring at this bear, realizing, oh my God, it's going to charge me. But before she could even turn to run, the bear had ran at full speed and jumped at her. Natalia turned and she tried to run, but the bear bit down on her thigh, and she felt it crush her leg and pull her to the ground and whip her up against a nearby birch tree. And she's screaming and trying to pull herself away, but the bear is ripping at her leg, trying to yank her back into the forest. And then Natalia, she sees her little drill that she uses to set the tap in the trees, and she reaches out and she grabs it, and she turns, and her leg is being actively eaten by this bear. And she turns on the drill, and she's about to jam it into the bear's eye when the bear suddenly stands up to its full height and then just falls all its weight down onto Natalia's chest. And immediately, Natalia dropped the drill, and the bear clenched down on her throat. Now, at this point, Valia, who again is hard of hearing, she didn't know what was going on, she turned around and saw this bear mauling her friend. And so what does she do? She runs over to this bear right behind it and begins pummeling this bear and screaming at it to get off her friend. And the bear, who barely registers Valia hitting it, it just lets go of Natalia for a second. It turns around, and you gotta remember, this bear has been eating Natalia. Its face is covered in her blood. And it turns and looks at Valia, and Valia, she's terrified, she begins stumbling backwards, and the bear is clearly about to jump on Valia when Natalia, who's barely alive, she sees this happening, and she just begins screaming at this bear while she's laying there bleeding out, trying to attract the bear to come back and keep eating her to spare Valia. And it works. The bear, hearing Natalia screaming behind it, forgets about Valia and turns back around and resumes eating Natalia. And then just seconds later, the bear actually lifted up Natalia by her neck and it ran off into the woods carrying her. And so Valia is just left watching this happen. She knows she's not going to be able to stop this bear, and so she just begins running back towards the car, which was not that far from where they were. And when she got out there, she grabbed her phone and she called the authorities. About an hour and a half later, hunters sent by the police, along with animal control, arrived at this parking lot, and they found Valia, who was totally in shock, and she would tell the hunters and animal control where this birch tree grove was, where all this happened, and a moment later, the authorities headed into the woods. And after arriving at the birch tree grove, they actually saw the bear. It was by itself, and it turned and looked at them, and it began charging them, and they all raised their rifles, and they fired at the bear. And they shot it enough times that the bear collapsed right in front of them, and then they shot it one more time to make sure the bear was dead. But there was no sign of Natalia anywhere. But then suddenly, the authorities turned and saw something move off in the distance, and out from behind a tree came Natalia's little dog. It had somehow not sustained any injuries from this bear, even though the bear had originally gone after the dog. And the dog, it came up to the authorities and then quickly doubled back behind a tree. And so, kind of operating on instinct, the group followed the dog around the tree, and they saw the dog was closely guarding this kind of mound that was covered in sticks and leaves and dirt. And so one of the hunters walked over and looked down, and they realized there was a person underneath this mound. It was Natalia. They pulled off all of the dirt and the twigs, and they found her absolutely destroyed, mauled body. But Natalia was actually still alive. Brown bears are notorious for eating their prey while they are still alive. And in many cases, they will gravely wound their prey, but not let it die, because then the meat is fresher when they come back and eat it later. And so bears will wound their prey and then basically bury them, cover them up with sticks and dirt, kind of like putting it in the fridge, and then come back and eat them later on. And so Natalia was earmarked to be eaten later because she was still alive and buried. Natalia was rushed out of the forest to a nearby hospital, and she would stay there for several weeks because she had serious injuries from this bear. All over her body were these huge bite marks, and a lot of the flesh from her leg had been pulled off. But amazingly, she would recover, although the trauma of nearly being eaten by a bear has never left her.
Our next story is called Grizzly Man.
Known as the Grizzly Man, Timothy Treadwell was, above all else, a huge bear enthusiast. His passion for these creatures led to a passion for environmentalism and for documentary filmmaking, the subject of which were the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska. And so starting in the late 1980s, Treadwell began going to Katmai National Park and setting up a camp there for the whole summer and filming all of his interactions with the grizzly bears. During the first half of the summer, Treadwell would stay in an area that he referred to as the Grizzly Sanctuary. It was this area near Hallow Bay. It was this big, open, green field. And all the grizzly bears seemed to just converge on this one area and kind of mosey around and be lazy. They were not aggressive at all towards Treadwell, and so he could walk up fairly close to them and just shoot great footage of these huge animals. During the second half of the summer, he would leave the Grizzly Sanctuary and go south to an area called Kaflia Bay. Then it was a much more densely forested area with lots of grizzly bear trails. Treadwell could use vegetation to get right up close to some of these bears without them necessarily seeing him. He referred to this area as the Grizzly Maze. Treadwell developed a fairly bad reputation amongst the park rangers of Katmai National Park because he was pretty reckless about how he interacted with these animals. I mean, they are big, wild predators, and he would get right up close and in their personal space, and every time he was just rolling the dice because eventually they thought something bad was going to happen to him. Treadwell believed he was taking every precaution and that what he was doing was safe. But Treadwell had become very emotionally connected to the grizzly bears he was seeing at Katmai National Park. He felt so comfortable with them that he would actually walk up sometimes and pet and goof around with the bear cubs. And for whatever reason, the grizzly bear parents would not harm him. And so he felt like he was kind of one of them, and they respected him and they welcomed him into their environment. Normally, whenever Treadwell went to Alaska for the summer, he would go alone. It was just him and his camera. But at the end of the summer, in October 2003, when normally Timothy would leave Alaska, because October is the time when the grizzlies become more aggressive because they're trying to eat as much food as they can before going into hibernation, Timothy decides that instead of leaving, he's going to extend his stay one more week, and he's going to fly his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, into Alaska to spend that week with him. Friends and family did not think this was a good idea, but Timothy was like, nope, it's going to be just fine. I know these animals better than anybody else. They are not going to hurt us. So he flies Amy in, and they set up camp along a grizzly trail inside of the grizzly maze. Neither of them were carrying a weapon or bear repellent spray. A week later, when the pilot returned to pick up Timothy and Amy, he looked up the hill and he could clearly see their campsite was not broken down. They had not packed it up yet. They were not down at the shoreline. So he gets out of his plane and he starts walking up the hill towards their campsite, thinking maybe they lost track of time. Maybe they don't know they're getting picked up today. And as he crests the hill, he sees there is a huge grizzly bear pacing around as if guarding its prey in the middle of this campsite. The grizzly sees the pilot and makes a move as if he's going to run towards him. The pilot turns, runs back to his plane, and flies out of there. And he calls park rangers and alerts them to this grizzly bear that's in the middle of Timothy and Amy's campsite. When the park rangers finally arrived and made their way up to the campsite, they could tell right away that Timothy and Amy were deceased. Their remains were scattered all around this campsite. It was clear that a grizzly bear, or more than one grizzly bear, had absolutely ripped them to pieces. However, this wasn't even the most horrifying part of this discovery. As the bodies were being taken away, the park rangers began bundling up their stuff to take with them, and they found inside the tent a camera that had a 6-minute tape on it. At first, when they hit play, they thought it was a blank tape, but it wasn't. It was just inside the tent when it was recording, and so it had no visual, but then they started hearing audio. And for 6 agonizing minutes with a blank screen, they heard crystal clear audio of Timothy and Amy being eaten alive by a grizzly bear. The audio suggests that Treadwell had left their tent because they heard a bear outside and was attacked. And he starts screaming for Amy to come outside. The bear has Timothy's head in its jaws, and Timothy is screaming, "It's killing me, it's killing me." And Amy is screaming back, "Play dead." And at some point, it's clear that's not working. They have no way to fight the animal. And Timothy starts yelling for Amy to run away. She's paralyzed with fear. She's screaming at the top of her lungs. And then Timothy is groaning and screaming, and eventually it stops when he drags Timothy away. And then Amy doesn't try to run away. She's just kind of frozen in terror, and you hear the bear come back, and then her screams pick up, and then the tape goes quiet.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Exposure. Saturday, April 25th, 1987, was a beautiful spring day in the mountains of northwest Montana. It was exactly the kind of day that 40-year-old Charles Gibbs and his wife Glenda had been waiting for months. The sky was clear, the sun was bright, and the breeze was warm. And so, at around 9 a.m. that morning, Charles and Glenda had a quick breakfast inside of their house in the rural city of Libby, and then they started stuffing their backpacks full of their hiking equipment. Charles and Glenda were going to go to Glacier National Park, which is a 1 million acre wilderness preserve with alpine meadows, forests, rivers, and lakes that are so bright and crystal blue, they almost look like they're glowing. The park is ringed by snow-covered mountains, and it's dotted with glaciers, which are huge masses of pure ice that jut up out of the rock and make you feel like you've stumbled onto some ancient frozen planet. The park is actually so otherworldly that when Hollywood producers were looking for a location to shoot the heaven scene in the big movie What Dreams May Come, they chose Glacier National Park as their location. And for Charles and Glenda, this place practically was heaven. It was the place they went all the time to go hiking, especially on beautiful sunny spring days. After packing all of their gear, Charles and Glenda made their way out the front door and began heading to their car, when as they were walking, Charles suddenly stopped short, shook his head, turned around, and ran back inside the house. When he came back out again, he was carrying his camera bag, and so he ran over to the car, he sat down in the driver's seat, and he grinned at his wife, and he held up the bag, and he said, "Now we're ready." Both Charles and Glenda worked for the public schools in Libby. Glenda was an elementary school teacher, and Charles drove a school bus. But like a lot of people who lived in Montana, their real passion was the outdoors. And for Charles specifically, his real passion was wildlife photography. He was actually a pretty accomplished amateur photographer. He'd had a couple of photo exhibits locally, and he'd gotten a few of his pictures published in the local newspaper. But what Charles really wanted to do with his photography was get one of his wildlife pictures published in a weekly publication called the Hungry Horse News. The Hungry Horse News was a tiny publication, but they had won a Pulitzer Prize, which is the highest award for American journalism. And the Hungry Horse News was famous for its nature photography. Charles had been submitting his work for years to the Hungry Horse News, but the editor kept rejecting them, telling Charles that his photos were totally beautiful, but they weren't dynamic enough. Nothing was happening in these photos. And so that morning, on the couple's drive to Glacier National Park, Charles began talking out loud to Glenda about what strategy he was going to use for his photographs during their hike. What route they were going to be on and what was the best angle to take certain pictures. And as Glenda listened to Charles, she just smiled to herself because it was like no matter how many times Charles got shot down by the Hungry Horse News, she knew he was never going to give up. And so she loved his determination and just unflappable attitude about his craft. At around 11 a.m., Charles and Glenda pulled off the highway and began heading towards the trailhead where they would start their hike that day, which was located at the base of Elk Mountain on the southern border of the park. The route they had chosen for that day was not one of the most popular at the park, and the reason for that was the trail was really steep, and in certain parts of it, it was fairly overgrown, and so really only the most hardcore hikers would go up this trail, of which there weren't that many. And so Charles and Glenda were used to being on this trail and seeing no one. But they preferred it that way. They loved being alone out in nature. Finally, they reached the gravel parking lot right at the trailhead, and Charles parked their car, and then he and Glenda hopped out, they grabbed their bags, and then began walking on this trail. The first mile of this trail brought the couple out along an abandoned road, and then over some railroad tracks, and then out into this beautiful field full of white flowers, and then the trail really started to get difficult because it basically went straight up the side of a mountain. And as they walked up this really steep part of the trail, Charles was nonstop taking pictures of everything he saw. There were deer and mountain goats, and at some point the couple reached a clearing on this steep section where they could look down and see a lake, and they saw there were beavers hard at work building a dam. And so, of course, Charles got a picture of that too. Now, these were the days before digital photography, and so all these pictures that Charles was taking, he couldn't actually see. He needed to go home and develop the film to see if anything he took was worth keeping. But as Charles and Glenda continued their hike up this mountain, Charles was getting more and more excited about some of the shots he was getting. He felt like they were going to be really, really good, and Hungry Horse News was going to finally accept his work. The couple made it to the summit of this trail by early afternoon, and from up there, they had this beautiful panoramic view of all these jagged mountaintops that were covered in snow, separated by these huge valleys and prairies, and Charles and Glenda were the only ones up there, and so they had this unbelievable view all to themselves. And so the couple would eat the lunch that they brought with them while sitting on this rocky outcropping, kind of looking out over this stunning view. And then when they were done, they packed up their stuff and began heading back down because they knew they wanted to get off of this trail and out of the park before sundown. It was just about 5 p.m. when Charles and Glenda had reached the final slope of this steep section of the trail, and they were getting closer and closer to that big open field with the white flowers. And as they're going down this last section of steepness, Charles suddenly grabs Glenda and stops her and puts his fingers to his lips and then turns around and points behind him. Charles was visibly excited about whatever he was pointing at, but when Glenda looked in the direction he was pointing, she couldn't see anything, but she obviously knew that whatever he was pointing at, Charles wanted to take a picture of it. Now, Glenda by this point was really tired from the hiking and just wanted to go back to the car and go home. I mean, after all, Charles had taken dozens and dozens of pictures that day, like we don't need to get one more. And so Glenda would look at Charles impatiently, basically suggesting like, come on, we can come back another time. But Charles didn't budge, and he looked at her like, please, I want to get one more photo. And so Glenda kind of did one of these and was like, okay. And Charles said, thank you, I'll meet you at the car. And so Glenda stood there and watched as her husband got his camera out, turned around, and began slowly making his way back up the trail. And again, Glenda's looking. She can't see what he's going to take a picture of, but she figured, he had his plan. And Glenda, she turned around and began heading back down towards the car. It didn't take long for Glenda to get back to the car. She got there right around 6 p.m. And when she got there, she hopped inside, sat in the front passenger seat, turned on the radio, and then she expected to have to wait for maybe another 20 minutes or so for Charles to finish up and come join her. But Glenda, after sitting in the car, was so tired that she accidentally fell asleep. And when she woke up again, she was kind of disoriented, and immediately she looked to see if her husband was in the car with her, and he wasn't. And she's looking outside. It's getting pretty dark out. She glanced at her watch. It was 7 p.m., which means Charles had left her for at least an hour by this point. And she's thinking, there's no way Charles would have been gone for an hour. He would never do that. He would never leave me alone like that. And so Glenda began glancing around her, kind of half expecting to see Charles just outside of their car, doing something. But she was all alone. There was no other hikers or cars. Charles wasn't there. And so starting to panic, Glenda got out of her car and began hustling back onto the trail to go look for Charles. And so she's yelling for Charles. She's looking around. It's getting darker and darker, and there's no sign of Charles. He's not calling back to her. It's just totally silent. So she walks along the abandoned road. She reaches the railroad tracks. She gets into that meadow with the white flowers, and still there's no sign of Charles. And she gets to the base of that steep section of the trail, and she's looking up at all these trees and how dark it was getting. And she's thinking to herself, if Charles is in trouble somewhere up there, there's no way I can help him by myself in the dark with no equipment. No one knows I'm here. I mean, this is an emergency and I need help. And so Glenda would scream a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing any response, she turned and ran all the way back to her car. She turned it on and she drove to the nearest ranger station. When she got there, she ran inside and immediately told the ranger where her and Charles had been, which trail they were on, and where roughly they were on this trail when she had gone to the car and Charles had turned around and gone uphill to take a picture of something. And as Glenda told the ranger all these details about where they were inside of the park, he really started to look worried. And when Glenda was done explaining, he told her that yes, we need to go right now and look for your husband, but I can't have you on that trail. It's too dangerous. And so this ranger had Glenda wait at the ranger station, and the ranger, by himself, headed back to the trailhead to go looking for Charles. And so the ranger, he gets to the trailhead, he hops out, he's got a rifle and a flashlight, and he begins walking along this trail, and by now, it's dark out. And so he's looking straight ahead with his flashlight and scanning side to side. He's calling out for Charles, and he's walking this trail. He gets all the way across the train tracks, through the meadow, and he gets to the steep section, and he actually begins going up this part of the trail until roughly the area where Glenda had described Charles going one way and her going back down. And when he got there, there was no sign of Charles, and so the ranger just took his rifle and fired 3 shots into the air, hoping that that might get Charles, if he was in the area, to hear him and call out or do something to indicate where he had gone. But after firing his gun, the ranger heard nothing. By this point, it was approaching midnight, it was totally pitch black outside, and the ranger knew that at this point, Charles was missing. and they really needed to organize a true search party to try to find him. But they would have to do that the next morning when they had light again. And so the ranger called out a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing anything, he reluctantly turned around and made his way back to his truck and drove back to the ranger station, where he would tell Glenda that he could not find her husband and they would now have to wait for sunrise. At sunrise the next morning, 20 searchers arrived at the trailhead where Charles and Glenda had been, and these searchers had dogs, and all the dogs had Charles's scent from some clothes that was in Glenda's car. And so this big search team very slowly and methodically began moving down this trail. And so they went across the abandoned road, over the train tracks, through the meadow with the white flowers. They got to the steep section of the trail, and they got all the way up to that point where Charles and Glenda had separated, and Charles had gone uphill to do whatever he was going to do. And it was at that point on the steep section that one of the searchers' dogs picked up Charles's scent and took off running uphill. And the searcher, whose dog this was, took off running after the dog. And the dog, it went up for a little while, up the steep rocky outcropping, and then it turned and began going down again until it reached a different meadow. So not the same one they walked through with the white flowers. This was farther away to the right. And in this meadow, the dog, who still very much had the scent, began to slow down, and it went straight for this tree. It was kind of a standalone tree right at the base of this steep section. And this tree had low hanging branches, maybe 5 feet off the ground. And the dog went right up to the tree, and then it stopped for a second. And the searcher by this point had caught up to the dog. And so he's looking at this tree, and he sees the ground looks really disturbed, and there's deep gouges in this tree. And then the dog went around this tree and sprinted another 50 feet or so, and then stopped like it had found something. And when the searcher caught up to his dog, he looked down and he found what they feared the most. It was Charles, and he was deceased. His body was totally mangled. His arms and legs were eaten away. There were deep cuts and gouges all over his body, and there was a blood trail from Charles all the way back to this tree. Also, just a few feet from Charles's outstretched hand was a camera, Charles's camera. Now, it was obvious that something horrific had happened to Charles, and there were clear signs of a struggle that took place near this tree, and then also over here where he was found, there were clear marks on the ground that there was some sort of fight that happened right here. But interestingly, Charles was carrying a gun, but it appeared that he did not unholster it and he didn't fire it. Instead, it almost looked like whatever was happening to Charles, he refused to put his camera down, which is why it was so close to his hand when he finally died. And so it was decided that the only way to determine what happened to Charles would be to develop his camera, to figure out what he was taking pictures of before he died. And so authorities would send off Charles's camera roll to be developed, and 2 weeks later, when they got it back, they couldn't believe what they saw. The photos very clearly told the story of what happened to Charles. This is what happened after Charles left his wife on that trail. When Charles stopped his wife and signaled to her that he wanted to take one more picture up the trail, he had found a photographic opportunity of a lifetime. The warm spring weather that had drawn Charles and Glenda out of their house to Glacier National Park had also woken the grizzly bears in the park from their hibernation. And what Charles had seen up the trail was a mother grizzly bear and her 3 cubs. The first few photographs that Charles would take of these bears were shot from a good distance away, and it just showed the mother bear and her 3 babies just kind of sauntering around the rocks, not really paying any attention to Charles. To Charles, grizzly bears were the most majestic creatures in nature. He didn't just love them, he viewed them as if they were sort of magical in some way. He was always going to local town meetings to speak about grizzly bears' beauty, and we needed to defend their natural habitat. As such, anyone who knew Charles knew about his passion for grizzlies. And while of course Charles knew that grizzly bears were dangerous, he also thought that the bears, who were very smart and sensitive, could sense his own very gentle and protective feelings towards them, and so if he was around them, they would never perceive him as a threat. Charles had taken some very good photos of other bears, black bears, but he had never taken what he called the definitive grizzly bear photo. And it was going to be this definitive grizzly photo of the mother and her 3 cubs that would finally get him a spot in the Hungry Horse News publication. As Charles took more and more photos of these bears, you could see in the photos that Charles was getting closer and closer and closer to this mother bear and her cubs. It was obvious that he was tracking them, even as the mother bear and the cubs were clearly trying to walk away from him. Finally, when Charles got about 50 feet away from this family of grizzly bears, he must have kicked a rock or stepped on a twig that broke that startled the bears. And so the second to last photo that Charles would take of this family shows the mother bear very clearly turning around to look at Charles, and she's making perfect eye contact with him, as is one of her cubs. Charles would take one more photo, and in this photo, you can see the bears are not just staring at Charles, they are running towards him. They are charging him. And it was likely after taking this photo that Charles realized the danger he was in. At this point, Charles tried to make a run for it by running down the side of this mountain. He got down to that tree with the low-hanging limbs, and he attempted to climb up into it, maybe hoping he could get one more picture of this bear if they would just leave him alone. But the mother bear and her cubs, they came charging down. They saw him up in the tree, and the mother bear began climbing into the tree, and she reached Charles. Now, she likely weighed about 400 pounds, and when mother grizzly bears are defending their young, they are absolutely merciless. And so she must have grabbed him or bit onto him and yanked him from the tree. And Charles somehow, after being pulled to the ground and getting slashed and bit by this bear, he managed to break away from her, as we can tell from the blood trail, and he made it about 50 feet away from this tree before the bear chased him down again, jumped on top of him, and killed him. When authorities figured out that Charles had managed to briefly get away from this mother grizzly bear and made it 50 feet away from her, they wondered why he hadn't pulled out his gun and shot at the bears to defend himself. But Charles's wife, Glenda, said it made perfect sense that Charles had not tried to harm this grizzly bear or her cubs. He loved grizzly bears, and he would never dream of leaving these 3 cubs without their mother. After Charles's death, the Rangers did not attempt to track down this bear and her cubs and do anything to the bears because they felt like the bears were just acting like bears and it was Charles who was in the wrong. And Charles's family and friends would say that is a decision that Charles would definitely support. Charles's photos of the grizzly bear family were published in the Hungry Horse News alongside an article about his death.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video form